Welcome to Compact History from compacthistories.com, where we explore the stories, events, and moments that shape the world in short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 113, The History of the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games began not as sport for entertainment, but as a ritual. Their origins lie in the religious life of ancient Greece, where physical excellence was bound tightly to honor, worship, and civic pride. According to tradition, the first recorded games were held in 776 BCE at Olympia, a sacred sanctuary rather than a city. This detail matters because the Olympics were never just about winning. They were about meaning. The games were held in honor of Zeus, king of the gods, and formed part of a much larger religious festival that included sacrifices, feasting, and processions. Athletes competed in full view of temples and altars, believing that physical excellence reflected moral and spiritual virtue. To win was not merely to be faster or stronger, but to demonstrate arete, the Greek ideal of excellence in mind and body. Participation was restricted. Only free Greek men were allowed to compete, and they had to prove their Greek identity. Women were barred not only from competition, but from attending, with severe penalties for violation. The Games were a mirror of Greek society, celebrating unity among city-states while simultaneously reinforcing exclusion and hierarchy. Despite frequent warfare between city-states, the Olympics created a rare space of cooperation. Before each Games, heralds declared an Olympic truce, known as the ekcheria, allowing athletes and spectators to travel safely through hostile territory. The truce did not end wars, but it paused them symbolically, reinforcing the idea that the Games stood above everyday conflict. For a few weeks every 4 years, competition replaced combat. The early program was simple. The first Olympics featured only a single event, the stadion race, a short sprint of roughly 192 meters. Over time, the schedule expanded to include wrestling, boxing, the pankration, chariot racing, and the pentathlon. These were brutal, often dangerous contests, with few rules and no weight classes. There were no medals. Victors received an olive wreath and something far more valuable, eternal glory. Winning athletes returned home as heroes. Cities rewarded them with free meals, public honors, and sometimes statues. Poets composed victory odes. Their names entered history in a way few others did. The Olympics became a calendar marker, a way of measuring time itself. For nearly 12 centuries, the ancient Olympics endured. They evolved, expanded, and sometimes declined, but their core purpose remained the same. They were sacred before they were sporting, communal before they were international, and symbolic long before they were commercial. Everything that followed, modern spectacle included, rests on this ritual foundation. The disappearance of the ancient Olympic Games was not sudden, dramatic, or widely mourned. Instead, it unfolded slowly, almost quietly, as the world that had sustained them changed beyond recognition. By the late Roman period, the Games were already a shadow of their former selves, surviving more from habit than belief. Rome admired Greek culture, but it did not share Greece's religious foundations in the same way. Athletic competition continued under Roman rule, yet priorities shifted. Spectacle replaced ritual. Gladiatorial combat, chariot racing, and mass entertainment drew crowds away from traditional Greek athletics. Physical excellence was still valued, but its spiritual meaning eroded. The Olympics became less sacred festival and more antiquated custom. The more profound shift was religious. As Christianity spread across the Roman world, pagan rituals increasingly fell out of favor. The Olympic Games were inseparable from worship of the old gods, particularly Zeus. Sacrifices, altars, and festivals were not decorative extras. They were the Games. Once those beliefs were rejected, the entire structure lost legitimacy. What had once unified Greek identity now appeared outdated, even offensive, to a new religious order. The decisive moment came in the late 4th century. In 393 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued decrees banning pagan religious practices. While no surviving document explicitly says the Olympics are cancelled, the effect was the same. Without legal protection or religious justification, the Games simply stopped. After nearly 1,200 years, they vanished. There was no farewell ceremony, no final champion, no sense that something historic had ended. The Olympics slipped into obscurity, their stadiums abandoned, their statues toppled or buried, their purpose forgotten. Earthquakes, floods, and neglect gradually reclaimed the sites. Olympia became ruins long before it became archaeology. For centuries, the Olympics existed only as fragments in ancient texts. Writers like Pausanias preserved descriptions of events and victors, but these accounts were read by scholars, not the public. The Games were remembered as curiosities of a vanished pagan world, not as a living tradition waiting to be revived. This long silence is crucial to understanding the modern Olympics. There was no unbroken chain linking ancient athletes to modern competitors, no inherited rules, no continuous institution. The Olympics did not evolve. They ended completely, and for over a millennium they stayed ended. When interest eventually returned, it came from historians, antiquarians, and romantics digging through ruins and manuscripts. The Olympics had become an idea rather than an event, a symbol of a lost world rather than a functioning institution. Their absence created space for reinvention, but it also ensured that any revival would be something new, shaped as much by modern values as ancient memory. The silence was long, but it was not empty. It preserved the Olympics as myth, waiting for a world ready to imagine them again. When the Olympic Games reappeared in the modern world, they did not return as a continuation of an ancient tradition, but as a conscious act of reinvention. The revival was driven less by sport itself and more by ideology, a belief that athletic competition could educate, civilize, and even unite nations in an increasingly fractured world. The central figure in this revival was Pierre de Coubertin, a French aristocrat and educational reformer deeply concerned about the physical and moral condition of youth. Inspired by the British public school system and by archaeological discoveries in Greece, Coubertin believed that organized sport could build character, discipline, and international understanding. The ancient Olympics provided the perfect symbolic framework for this vision. Crucially, Coubertin was not trying to recreate the ancient games in any literal sense. He had little interest in religious ritual, naked athletics, or exclusion based on city-state identity. Instead, he borrowed the name, the prestige, and the idealized spirit of ancient Greece, while designing something firmly modern. The Olympics would be international rather than Greek, secular rather than sacred, and educational rather than ceremonial. In 1894, Coubertin convened an international congress in Paris that led to the creation of the International Olympic Committee. 2 years later, in 1896, the first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens, deliberately chosen to link the new movement to its ancient roots. The scale was modest. Fewer than 300 athletes competed, all of them men, from just 14 nations. Events included athletics, gymnastics, fencing, wrestling, and cycling. There was no Olympic Village, no global broadcasting, and little commercial involvement. Yet the symbolism mattered more than the spectacle. Athletes marched under national flags. Victors were celebrated as representatives of their countries rather than their cities. Medals replaced olive wreaths, signaling a shift from honor alone to measurable achievement. The Games were framed as a celebration of peaceful competition, even as nationalism quietly embedded itself at their core. The early modern Olympics were fragile. Several editions struggled financially, organizationally, or both. Some were overshadowed by world fairs, others attracted limited international attention. There was nothing inevitable about the Games' survival. They endured because a small group of organizers believed fiercely in their mission and were willing to adapt when idealism collided with reality. What emerged from this period was a new Olympic identity. The Games were no longer religious festivals or elite rituals, but global events shaped by diplomacy, education, and aspiration. They carried echoes of ancient Greece, but their foundations were unmistakably modern. The revival of the Olympics was not an act of preservation. It was an act of creation. By reimagining an ancient idea for a new age, the modern Olympics laid the groundwork for everything that followed: triumphs, controversies, contradictions, and all. The moment the Olympic Games became international, politics followed them through the gates. Although organizers spoke passionately about neutrality and peace, the reality was unavoidable. When athletes compete as representatives of nations, sport becomes a proxy for power, identity, and ideology. By the early 20th century, the Olympics were no longer just games. They were statements. National flags and anthems transformed individual victories into collective ones. A win was not simply personal achievement, but evidence of national strength, discipline, or superiority. Governments quickly recognized the value of this symbolism. Funding athletes, hosting games, and topping medal tables became ways to project prestige on the world stage without firing a shot. The first major fracture appeared in the aftermath of the First World War. The defeated powers were excluded from the 1920 and 1924 Games, shattering the illusion that the Olympics stood above global conflict. Participation was no longer universal or apolitical. The Games reflected the world as it was, divided, resentful, and unstable. This tension reached its most disturbing expression in 1936, when the Olympics were held in Berlin under Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime. The Games were staged as a showcase of German order, efficiency, and supposed racial superiority. Stadiums, ceremonies, and media coverage were carefully orchestrated propaganda tools. Yet, the spectacle did not unfold as planned. The success of athletes like Jesse Owens directly challenged Nazi ideology, exposing the limits of political control over sporting outcomes. After the Second World War, the Olympics became a Cold War battleground. The United States and the Soviet Union used medal counts as informal scoreboards in their ideological rivalry. Athletic systems were professionalized, scientific, and intensely competitive. Boycotts followed. The US-led boycott of the 1980 Moscow Games and the Soviet-led response in 1984 demonstrated how fragile the Olympic ideal remained when geopolitics intervened. At the same time, the Games became platforms for protest. In 1968, Black American athletes raised gloved fists on the medal podium, turning a moment of triumph into a global political statement. Their action underlined a new reality. The Olympics were too visible, too symbolic to remain politically silent. Athletes were not just competitors. They were citizens with voices. Organizers continued to insist on neutrality, but neutrality itself became a political position. Decisions about which nations could compete, which flags could be flown, and which statements were permitted were all inherently political acts. By the late 20th century, it was clear that politics had not corrupted the Olympics, it had revealed them. The Games did not exist outside the world's conflicts and values. They absorbed them, reflected them, and sometimes amplified them. The stadium had become a global stage, and what played out there mattered far beyond the finish line. As the 20th century progressed, the Olympic Games transformed from a largely idealistic sporting festival into one of the most powerful commercial and media events on the planet. This shift was not sudden, nor entirely planned, but once money, broadcasting, and branding entered the equation, there was no realistic way back to amateur purity. The turning point came with television. Early broadcasts were limited and regional, but by the 1960s, the Olympics had become perfect programming. They offered drama, national rivalry, clear narratives, and emotional payoff, all wrapped in a fixed schedule. As global audiences grew, broadcasters were willing to pay enormous sums for the rights. Those fees quickly became the financial backbone of the Games. With broadcast money came corporate sponsorship. Brands recognized that the Olympics offered something advertising rarely could: association with excellence, unity, and global goodwill. Logos appeared on signage, equipment, and eventually athletes themselves. Sponsorship deals funded infrastructure, athlete development, and increasingly ambitious ceremonies. The Olympics grew bigger, louder, and more polished with each edition. Hosting the Games became a statement of arrival on the world stage. Cities competed fiercely for the right to host, promising regeneration, tourism, and international prestige. The scale of construction ballooned. Stadiums, athlete villages, transport systems, and security operations turned the Olympics into mega projects, often costing tens of billions. Success brought global attention. Failure left debt, unused venues, and political fallout. Athletes were also changing. The old ideal of amateur competition quietly collapsed under the weight of reality. Training at an elite level required time, resources, and financial support. Gradually, professionals were admitted, most famously in basketball in 1992, when global stars competed openly for the first time. The Olympics no longer pretended to be separate from professional sport. It embraced it. The spectacle reached new heights with opening and closing ceremonies that resembled theatrical productions rather than civic rituals. Technology, choreography, and narrative turned the Games into global entertainment events watched by billions. These ceremonies became opportunities for host nations to tell carefully curated stories about their history, values, and ambitions. Critics argued that something essential had been lost. Commercial pressure influenced scheduling, event selection, and even host choices. The gap between rich and poor sporting nations widened. The Games risked becoming more about sponsors than sport. Yet commercialization also ensured survival. It funded global participation, supported athletes, and kept the Olympics relevant in a crowded media landscape. Without it, the Games might have faded into obscurity. By the end of the century, the Olympics had become a paradox. They were at once idealistic and commercial, inspiring and controversial, global and deeply political. The Games had become a spectacle, but one with unmatched reach and influence, capable of captivating the world, even as it reflected all its contradictions. In the 21st century, the Olympic Games exist in a state of permanent tension between ideals and realities. They remain one of the few events capable of commanding the world's attention, yet they are also increasingly scrutinized, criticized, and questioned. The Olympics endure not because they are perfect, but because they continue to matter. At the heart of the modern Games is the Olympic ideal, the belief that sport can promote peace, understanding, and shared humanity. This language remains central to the mission of the International Olympic Committee, and it still resonates with athletes and audiences alike. Moments of genuine connection, competitors embracing across national lines, underdogs triumphing against the odds, continue to give the Games emotional power. At the same time, controversy has become inseparable from the Olympic story. Doping scandals have repeatedly damaged trust, exposing the pressure placed on athletes to win at any cost. Judging disputes, corruption allegations, and opaque decision-making have fueled skepticism about governance. Each Olympic cycle seems to arrive with its own crisis, followed by renewed calls for reform. Hosting the Games has also become more contentious. Public opposition has grown as citizens question the cost, displacement, and long-term value of Olympic infrastructure. Several cities have withdrawn bids after referendums or political backlash. In response, organizers have attempted to scale back ambitions, reuse venues, and emphasize sustainability, but skepticism remains. The promise of legacy is no longer taken at face value. Athlete voices have grown louder. Social media has given competitors direct platforms, reducing their dependence on official narratives. Athletes now speak openly about mental health, political identity, and inequality, sometimes in defiance of regulations designed to preserve neutrality. This has forced a reckoning. The idea that athletes can be both apolitical symbols and silent representatives has proven increasingly unrealistic. Yet despite these pressures, the Olympics persist. Viewership remains enormous. Young athletes still dream of competing. Host cities still apply. The Games continue to provide a shared global moment in an age of fragmented attention. Few events can still stop the world, even briefly. What has changed most is perception. The Olympics are no longer seen as above criticism. They are treated as a human institution, capable of inspiration and failure in equal measure. This may be their greatest strength. By surviving scrutiny, the Games adapt rather than collapse. The history of the Olympic Games is not a steady march toward perfection. It is a cycle of ambition, compromise, excess, and renewal. The ancient Greeks sought honor. Modern organizers seek relevance. Athletes seek meaning. Audiences seek connection. As long as those desires persist, so will the Olympics, not as a flawless symbol of unity, but as a complicated mirror of the world itself, striving, flawed, and still reaching for something better. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact History, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compacthistory.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, warfare, disasters, mysteries, and true crime. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/historycoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.